Hello, welcome to CubsPS Plus, the Northside Numbers Game, a weekly podcast that dives headfirst into the analysis of hot topics driving Chicago Cubs baseball. I'm your host, Mike Waller, a lifelong Cub fan, full-time baseball stat nerd, and sometime youth baseball coach. CubsPS Plus is part of the Bleacher Bunch Productions on the Fans First Sports Network, joining great shows like The Sun Ranto Show, Cup of Cubby Blue, and Baseball Rabbit Hole. The Bleacher Bunch feed is always available wherever it is you get your podcasts, and CubsPS Plus is available ad-free to Patreon supporters at patreon.com/CubsPS Plus, where you can support the show and find a variety of benefits for as little as $1 a month. In addition to the podcast feeds, you can also find me on Twitter or X, Instagram, TikTok, Threads, Blue Sky, and YouTube, all at CubsPS Plus, a spin on the baseball metric OPS Plus. Love the pod or hate it, please drop a review wherever it is you find your podcasts. If you've done that, thank you so much. Maybe you can share this episode with a friend. It's December 11th, my son's 21st birthday, and the winter meetings are sizzling hot. The Cubs? Rumors are hot, but so far it's just chatter. Let's get into it. Are you ready? I'm ready. Here we go. Welcome into episode 97. No Cub has ever worn number 97, so I was trying to think of something to come up with today and just didn't feel right. I could have come up with a stat, found a season where the Cubs won 97 games, but let's just call this the Ryne Sandberg, another Ryne Sandberg episode of this podcast. Tip of the cap to Ryno, who's announced that his cancer has come back and spread. So I know we're all wishing him the best, and hopefully he's able to fight that cancer back again. But it's hard. It's not great news. I'm so glad he was able to get the adoration he's so well earned this summer when he got the statue at Wrigley Field. I'm happy I got to see it. Just wish him the best. I talk about my Cubs past a lot, and my Cubs past is essentially Ryne Sandberg. I mean, I found the Cubs just last week. I was talking about finding the Cubs on WGN when I was 8. That's the year the Cubs traded for Sandberg. I was there for his rookie year. I was there watching him struggle. And then I was 10 years old in 1984 when he won MVP and just became the guy we remember. And I don't know, my childhood would not be the same without Ryne Sandberg. Lifelong Cub, lifetime full of great memories. So we wish you the best, Ryno, and we're all behind you. But let's get into this episode now. So we're in the middle of winter meetings. All of a sudden, it's been kind of slow, not a whole lot going on. And then the last, 12 hours, like really today, things have really started to heat up. There's been a lot of talk, obviously, with the Cubs. We've talked about it on this show and other shows as well. The Cubs have not shown a ton of interest in free agents. They did sign Matthew Boyd on what's looking like a pretty friendly contract at this point. So far the guys who have signed, Frankie Montas, just on and on and on, like in the guy who signed with Texas today for 3 years, $75 million, Eovaldi. Can't believe that. I can't spell it, but I should be able to remember to say it. Pitching's been expensive so far. And so far, obviously, Juan Soto was expensive. I won't spend a lot of time on Juan Soto. The Cubs were never going to be in on that. They could have been. We can talk about all the woulds and coulds and shoulds, but it was clear from the start they were not going to be. I think they just made their decision. They were not going to play in that space, so they didn't waste any time on it. What we have heard is trade rumors. Now, the Cubs have been pretty clearly reportedly wanting to trade Cody Bellinger. I think Jed Hoyer went into this offseason fully expecting him to opt out of his contract, and he did not. All of a sudden, in the last 12 hours, the last 24 hours, there's been a lot of chatter about Seiya Suzuki and his no-trade clause. And his agent, Jared Wolf, yesterday did point out did indicate that Jed has come to them throughout this offseason talking about teams that have inquired about Seiya and where he might be open to go on a trade. I do not think the Cubs are hell-bent on trading Seiya Suzuki. So if you listen to the comments yesterday, the first comment from Wolf came out of the blue, just saying that basically Seiya didn't want a DH. He wanted to play the outfield, and he was open to a trade if there was one that worked to the right kind of city. And it kind of came off as, whoa, is this a situation where there's a tarnished relationship and damaged relationship and Seiya wants to get out, or the Cubs are trying to actively shop him and there are hurt feelings? But Megan Montemurro did a great job throughout the day on consistently going to Jed, going to the agent, and there were a number of follow-up quotes that really softened and really Wolf had walked back his original comments. I don't think they were intended to come off as harshly as they first read in the early reports. It sounds like teams have come to the Cubs asking if there would be interest in trading Seiya. I mean, there should be. I mean, Seiya's a really good hitter. When you look at his offensive numbers, he's a certainly a top 20 outfielder in the game. So he makes a lot of teams better. He struggled in the outfield. There's some people saying he could never play in my outfield. I'm not there. He's had some really, really big, impactful defensive misplays. No question. We'll never know, but he may have cost the Cubs the playoffs in 2023 when he dropped that ball in Atlanta. He's just had a few of those moments. I don't think he's a terrible outfielder. He's not going to win a Gold Glove, but I think he can play out there. Just the question that, like last year, down the stretch especially, you have Pete Crow Armstrong in center, who's amazing defensively, and you have Cody Bellinger, who won his Gold Glove in right field, playing right field. So if you are looking at those three players and one of them is going to DH, of course it's going to be Seiya. Seiya can be a competent right fielder, but he's not going to be better than Cody Bellinger. There's also, I think, with Seiya, at least in my mind, I've not seen this come out from the Cubs, but there's got to be concerns about health and long-term injury. He has missed a month or more each of the 3 seasons he's been with the Cubs. In the last 2 seasons, they've specifically been oblique strains. So the Cubs finding a way to keep Seiya's bat in the lineup, potentially minimize the physical toll on the rest of his body, makes a lot of sense to me. So I don't know, but as he's walked it back, it's become more and more clear that, I don't think there's any intention of Seiya to come off as saying he refuses to DH, or if he's a DH, he wants out of town. I don't think that's the case at all. I don't think Seiya and his agent are pushing for a trade. I think they've just come to the point where, the agent's speaking on his client's behalf, obviously. Seiya Suzuki has 2 years left in Chicago. If he spends the next 2 years as a DH primarily, when he goes for that next contract, it's going to hurt his value on the market. So, of course, he wants to be considered an outfielder. It makes perfect sense. So it's all posturing and negotiation, and I wouldn't read a whole lot into it. Jed has come out repeatedly now in the last, certainly today at the end of yesterday, saying that if there's a deal that makes sense, then they're open to trading Seiya Suzuki if it's one of the teams he approves. But, he has said now repeatedly that he really does not expect Seiya to get traded. Of course, that doesn't mean he won't be. Just means that I don't think there's a clear intent there. So other players to be traded, we've talked about Nico Hoerner. There have apparently been maybe potentially some discussions with Seattle. So let's get into the rumors that we've seen. So the hot rumor early this week, right at the beginning of the winter meetings, was a 3-way deal with Seattle and the White Sox. And that deal included some combo of Nico Hoerner and or Cody Bellinger. And we all know Seattle needs bats, and they have a surplus of arms. And the White Sox were in the mix at the time trying to trade Garrett Crochet. Now, as of today, Garrett Crochet has been traded for 4 prospects. I think it's the Red Sox number 4, 5, 11, and 14 prospects going back to Chicago, headlined by catching prospect Kyle Teal. And Garrett Crochet goes to Boston. So Garrett Crochet is now off the table. So the 3-way trades that were being rumored were going to be expensive for the Cubs, involving some combination of Hoerner and or Bellinger, and then a package of prospects like Owen Casey, possibly Cam Smith, Cade Horton, on and on and on. But the deal, what the Jed was reportedly pushing for, was to come out of that trade with both Luis Castillo and Garrett Crochet, which would have been an absolute coup. That would have been tremendous. You'd get Luis Castillo as a guy you could plug in the top of your rotation right now and take on his money for the next 3 to 4 years. He's got 3 years for sure. An option for a 4th that with certain innings, targets, and things like that could automatically vest. And so if you get Luis Castillo as the pitcher you want him to be, you want that option to automatically vest and have him for 4 years. I think that kind of a deal could still be on the table. Obviously now with Garrett Crochet going to the Red Sox, I think the White Sox are no longer part of this. I think it still makes a lot of sense to deal with Seattle. There are, they have a good young set of starting pitching. I think they'd like to get out of Luis Castillo's contract. And I don't know what it would take. I think Cody Bellinger and Luis Castillo make a lot of sense. They're fairly similar money. Bellinger's a little bit more on an average annual value basis, but you only have him for this year, plus whatever he does with the option for next. And meanwhile, Luis Castillo is under contract for about $21 million AAV for 3 more seasons, plus that 4th year that could vest. I think it'd be a good deal. The Cubs could flip some extra prospects Seattle's way, or they could pick up some money to try to make it work, but that makes a lot of sense. Seattle could also use Nico Hoerner. So Nico Hoerner is another possibility in that deal. We'll also talk about, while we're on Cody Bellinger, we'll talk about the Yankees. The Yankees are seen, especially now that they've missed on Juan Soto, as one of the front runners to potentially get Cody Bellinger. The Yankees, that's a Freudian slip. The Yankees' everyday lineup is kind of a mess right now. They have Aaron Judge. They already had their issues at shortstop during the year. Gleyber Torres is a free agent. They lost Juan Soto. Anthony Rizzo's option was not picked up. So while the Yankees are rumored to be in on a lot of guys, they've been rumored to maybe be looking at a deal for Nolan Arenado, potentially signing Christian Walker, potentially trading for Cody Bellinger, potentially signing Alex Bregman. They haven't done those things yet, so the Yankees have a lot of needs. And so a deal for Cody Bellinger would make sense. He's got left-handed power, which plays well with the short porch in right field in Yankee Stadium. It's just a matter of where the sides are right now. I'm recording this late in the afternoon on Wednesday, December 11th, so the rumor mill is going hot. Something may break while I'm on here. If I see it as I flip back and forth with Twitter, I'll make mention of it. But the last I heard on the Cody Bellinger deal with the Yankees was that the Yankees were holding on the Cubs not picking up any of Bellinger's money. Now, I've seen some people read into that as the Cubs are cheap or salary dumping. I wouldn't read much into that at this point. It's posturing. We hear it every trade deadline. When you trade a guy away, and the Cubs did this in 2022 and 2023 and 2021 when they were, or 21 and 22 when they were selling. You kick in a little extra money and get a little bit better prospect return back. So I've not seen any rumors about what the Yankees would be giving back to the Cubs. I do think this would primarily be a move to free up both a position on the field and money to be reallocated elsewhere from Bellinger's contract. So I don't know that the Cubs are asking for a ton in return, but I'm sure if the Cubs are saying that they're not going to pick up any of Bellinger's money, then that tells me the return the Yankees are giving the Cubs on the deal doesn't warrant the Cubs picking up any money on the deal. The Cubs have shown plenty of willingness to do it over the years. So at this point, I would read that as nothing more than a little bit of public posturing, particularly when it's coming from the Yankees side, because as usual, we don't hear a ton from the Cubs side. But let's get into the big rumor that everybody wants to talk about. The one that I would love to end this podcast and find out, oh my God, this guy is a Cub. But there's been a lot of noise today, a lot of smoke from a lot of places about the Cubs being interested in Kyle Tucker. And Kyle Tucker would be an amazing get. Now, he's got 1 year left on his deal, but he's a big power hitter. He has, he's going to push a 900 OPS. He can hit 30 home runs, and he's 27. So next year will be his age 28 season, and then he's a free agent. And he's the kind of guy that's going to get a big package in free agency. So the ideal scenario is you trade for him now. You have a full year to work on an extension with him. And let's be honest, some guys extend and some guys don't. Juan Soto, it was made fairly clear he was never going to extend. I will say, though, even Boris clients, even guys who are going to hit the market, what we saw from Soto is why a lot of guys don't want to take that extension. Because Juan Soto got 15 years, $760 million, which is, well, I think we all saw that getting potentially crazy. I did not have him getting $60 million in real today money more than Shohei Ohtani got in deferred money on my Winter Meetings bingo card this year. So you can absolutely blow it out, but also at the same time, you can wind up in situations like Matt Chapman, Cody Bellinger, Jordan Montgomery, and Blake Snell were in last year, where the market kind of cools a little bit. You're not getting quite the money you want. Hang on, get a pillow contract and work it out. I don't think that would be the case with Bregman. Bregman is really good. So barring injury this year, I expect he's going to get paid. However, the Dodgers were able to trade for and extend Mookie Betts. The Mets traded for and extended Francisco Lindor. This does happen. So if nothing else, it gives the Cubs a year to work on it. It gives the Cubs a year to let Kyle Tucker enjoy what it means to be in the city of Chicago in the summer, what it means to play at Wrigley Field every day, to be the focus of all the adoration from the fans. I mean, Kyle Tucker's going to walk in, if the Cubs make this trade, and the Cubs have not made this trade, so he is not a Cub at this moment. He'll walk in as probably the most popular Cub day one. I mean, he's going to be loved. I think he's would have a great year. And he's the kind of bat you want to build around. And if the Cubs are ever going to finally offer that big contract where everybody can just stop saying Jed or Tom will never, he'd be a great guy to do it. Now, the absolute floor probably for Kyle Tucker would be 10 years, $350 million. You're probably not even talking without going to that level. And there's every chance he could get north of $400 million over. At that point, years don't matter so much. What you're seeing a lot of teams do now, I know Jed has always been a big fan of the shorter, higher AAV contracts. But what we're seeing a lot of teams do now is go with the tack on a couple extra years just to get that AAV down so you have a little bit more space to work with. Again, no idea what a contract with Kyle Tucker would look like in terms of total dollars. I just know you're probably looking north of $350 million for at least a decade. And that's okay. He's a really good player. You'd be paying him, 10 years, you'd be paying him into his late 30s. But there's every reason to think he's going to be a very productive hitter well into his mid 30s. So, if you're, say it all the time, if you're going to make that kind of play on that kind of player, that's going to somebody who commands big free agent dollars, you're going to have to take a couple years on the back end that don't look so great. But at the same time, baseball salaries, and maybe we'll hit some point where that changes, but until it does, baseball salaries consistently go up over time such that you get 10 years from now, guy making $35 million, per year, $40 million, $45 million now is going to be a top 10 paid player in baseball, top 15, something like that. In 10 years, he might not be top 50. So, but it's about the now. It's about the now for the Cubs. The Cubs have gone through, 7 straight seasons without a playoff win. They've gone, certainly 4 consecutive seasons without making the postseason if you count 2020, and that's just a whole weird season. The last time the Cubs were in the playoffs in a non-COVID year was 2018. That was a good baseball team that won 95 games, but they lost game 163, got put in the wild card game, and lost it to the Rockies. So the Cubs have not had any postseason success in 7 years. So it's time. And Jed Hoyer's on the last year of his deal. He has not been extended. So it's time to move. And the Cubs are in a position now where they've built the farm system up. They have 8 top 100 prospects. They have a number of them who are major league ready. They have a number of redundancies where you have a very crowded outfield. You have a very crowded infield in the sense that you have redundancy within some of the players. Matt Shaw looks tremendous. He was tearing it up with Team USA this year. Great season last year. Looks to be the real deal. But between him, James Triantos, and Cam Smith, who are all top 100 prospects in baseball, there's a little redundancy there. The 3 of them together are probably never going to be in the Cubs infield. So the Cubs have the ability to trade from a position of strength, trade from a position of depth. I think the Cubs have shown over the last 3-4 drafts since Dan Kantrovitz came in and took over that part of Cubs operations that the Cubs are going to do a good job of, drafting, identifying talent, developing those guys. And so I'm optimistic, and the Cubs are absolutely now in a position to, certainly bring some kids up. I've talked about, I want Matt Shaw to be on the opening day roster. I would love for there to be a path for Owen Casey if he's still a Cub, but get these guys a path, but also take advantage of their value now. For all the talk about the Cubs non-tendering Kyle Schwarber after the 2020 season, potentially the biggest failure with Kyle Schwarber was not recognizing the value and taking advantage. Well, probably not recognizing it. I think Theo Epstein absolutely recognized the value, but not taking advantage of the value he had after the 2015 and 2016 postseasons. Kyle Schwarber had an amazing first year in 2015 and then was just, we know what Kyle Schwarber does in the postseason. That's what he did in 2015. Put that homer against the Cardinals up on the Budweiser sign on the scoreboard, was just phenomenal. Then in 2016, after missing basically the whole season with a torn ACL, he comes back early, finds a way to get in the World Series, and is a key bat in those games the Cubs won in Cleveland. And at that point, he had a huge amount of value. Now, as things turned out, it would turn out that he would have some sporadic injuries. The Cubs kind of struggled to develop him with his strikeout rate. The Phillies have just kind of accepted the strikeout rate. He's going to walk, he's going to strike out, and he's going to hit for power. He's going to be I hit dingers guy, but he's going to do it in the major leagues. He's going to do it big time in the postseason. And he was kind of up and down majors, minors, kind of struggled. Had a really good 2020, but it was a 60-game, small sample size. And they wound up choosing to go in a different way. If the Cubs had traded him after 2015 or 2016, they would have easily been able to get major value back. Probably that cost-controlled starting pitcher they were never able to develop themselves. They probably could have done that. So the Cubs need to take advantage of the fact they have this value. If you wait around, some of Owen Casey's value is that he's a really good baseball player. Also, some of Owen Casey's value is that he's 21 years old. Or 22. I think he's 22 now. He's young. You can hang on to him. Maybe even if you trade for Kyle Tucker and you don't include Owen Casey in the deal and he's not traded. At that point, the Cubs outfield appears locked up. I mean, it looks like PCA is going nowhere. We hope he's the center fielder for the Cubs for the next decade. Ian Happ's under contract for 2 more years. Seiya's got 2 more years if he's not traded. Kyle Tucker would be here for 1 year. Presumably, the Cubs would hope to extend him. And it would look like the outfield is blocked. And you can certainly hang on to Owen Casey, but then who knows? Brendan Davis never got his shot in the major leagues. Had a couple injuries stack up, and all of a sudden, he became injury guy and never did get that shot. You also have other guys who, with more exposure, pitchers start to figure them out, even in the minors, and maybe he's not there. Or now the Dodgers still got big value from Michael Busch, but one of the complaints I heard from some Cubs fans when the Cubs made that trade was that he's a 26-year-old minor leaguer. So age matters in that value equation. And so the Cubs have a bunch of guys who are both really good, putting up really good numbers in the minor leagues, and are also quite young. And if the Cubs just sit on them, I talk about, I don't like to dehumanize baseball players here, but effectively when you look at the team from the business perspective, they're perishable assets. They have value for a finite period of time, and as they get older, they're less and less valuable. So, now's the time to deal. The Cubs have some organizational strength. They've shown the ability to develop players. They've shown the ability to identify and draft well. Don't trade them all. Obviously, you want to continue to have potentially guys to trade at the deadline if there's a piece you need. You want to be able to fill some depth from the minor leagues and actually have some of these guys come up and play. But when you have a chance to get Kyle Tucker, you get Kyle Tucker. I've heard a number of, one of the biggest deals I've seen, or one of the most common deals I've seen proposed, centers around Itzhak Paredes. And at first thought, you might think Kyle Tucker's this huge star, and all I see on Twitter for Itzhak Paredes is I suck Paredes, which is awful. I will never do it. I think it's terrible. But a lot of Cubs fans think he's terrible after the half season he had with them last year. He's not terrible. And I can also tell you he would not be terrible in Houston. So all those things that we read about his pull home runs to the short wall in left field in Tampa, it's even more so to the Crawford boxes in Houston. Houston is a right-handed pull hitter's dream. He would absolutely crush in Houston. And Houston wanted him last year. So I think the Cubs have a really good chance to get this done. There have been rumors back and forth about whether or not Seiya would be included in the deal, but it's starting to sound more and more like Itzhak Paredes for a package of prospects. Question then is, how big do you go? Because it is, now if the Cubs knew that they could, if the Cubs knew for sure they could extend Kyle Tucker, if baseball had sign and trade deals and they got that done before the trade, you'd give up the world for Kyle Tucker to have him on the Cubs team for the next decade. At that point, I don't know, not literally any cost, but name your prospect. There would be no untouchables. I'd put a couple really good ones together. Whatever, it's fine. What you'd probably be likely to see is something like Itzhak Paredes plus maybe like Owen Casey or Kevin Alcantara plus Ben Brown or Jordan Wicks. Kind of some either ors like that. It sounds like the Astros and Cubs have talked about a lot of different guys. I've seen some frustration. So this was all bubbling up, and we're seeing it from national writers. We're seeing it from Cubs writers. We're seeing it from Astros writers. We're seeing it from Yankees writers because the Yankees are also reportedly in on Kyle Tucker. I think all things being equal, one, I don't think Jim Crane for the Astros likes the Yankees at all. I think there's a lot of dislike there. And also, I do think while the Astros are kind of trying to rebuild, come off the team that had that big run, they have enough talent in-house at the major league level, and I think they're hoping to get some. It's been very clear they're looking for major league ready pieces in return. So I think they're trying to rebuild on the fly and stay relevant and competitive. So, I could see where, all things being equal, Crane would rather not send Kyle Tucker to the Yankees, where the Astros would potentially have to get through them in the postseason this year and going forward for the next decade. So I can see where, if deals are even close, the Cubs might make more sense. But also, the Astros don't have to trade him now. He's not prohibitively expensive yet. It's all about getting return in exchange. And so they could see how the season goes, potentially trade him at the deadline. I think what they don't want to do is get to a point where they walk away from him with nothing. So I think the conversations, from what I've been able to read between the lines, see the reports, it seems like things have gone far enough that it seems likely a deal can get done, except the deals, you throw a lot of guys out, and sometimes you get down to the bottom line. You get to, this is my best offer, this is my best offer, and if they're not close enough, sometimes they fall through at the last minute. Now, that said, deals can also continue. When Luis Arias was traded to the Padres last May, I think, after the season started, apparently the Marlins and the Padres had talked about an Arias trade like all through the offseason, so there was a lot of work in on it. I saw a report after the Red Sox got Crochet that the Red Sox were working hard with the White Sox on a deal last trade deadline. So sometimes these things persist and can linger and whatever, but I do think Houston wants to do it or not do it. So I wouldn't say it's going to be this week or bust, but I think it's going to be the next few weeks or bust, like in the mid-January or bust with someone. And while I say they would prefer to trade Tucker to the Cubs over the Yankees, they still have to get value. So if the Yankees are giving them a significantly better deal that meets their needs, they would do that. The other thing is, right now, I see frustration like, we've heard so much about this trade. Why isn't it happening? Why isn't it happening? Well, there are also other things in play. So you've got the Cubs talking to the Yankees about Bellinger. You've got the Yankees talking to Alex Bregman in free agency. You have the Astros still deciding on what they're going to do with Alex Bregman in free agency. And that might actually change the face of a Tucker deal. If the Astros decide to bring Alex Bregman back, then maybe they don't go for Itzhak Paredes. At that point, maybe they do come back and say, hey, we want Seiya Suzuki. And then that's a whole different discussion, and we kind of reset on the trade talks. If the Yankees get Bregman, it probably makes them maybe a little less likely to go for Kyle Tucker. Maybe not. But it impacts other things. And so I've read that Alex Bregman right now is kind of a pause button on this deal. They're working out some frameworks. Because I'm not sure Itzhak Paredes makes a ton of sense if they sign Alex Bregman. But also Itzhak Paredes might be, it's just the Astros decision. If the Astros decide they are out on Bregman, then there's no need to wait to see where Bregman signs unless the Astros fundamentally think they're going to get a significantly different offer from the Yankees based on whether or not they have Alex Bregman. And that'll be the Astros' call. But there are a lot of these things in place. Who do the Cubs want to give up, not give up? It's interesting seeing the Cub fans' reactions today. So it would be, if the Cubs make this deal happen, it's going to look like a very serious price for 1 year of Kyle Tucker, because it will be. They're going to give up some prospect capital that hurts. They might wind up giving up Seiya Suzuki, depending on what happens with Alex Bregman. It's going to make you clench a little bit, and that's okay. What I have wanted Jed to do for a long time now is take your shot. And I don't think, as much as the Cubs, Tom, Jed, wherever you want to put the blame, have been reluctant to issue that really big contract, I don't think the Cubs get this serious in trade talks for 1 year of Kyle Tucker, giving up what's being discussed as the potential return, if you don't have any plans to be that aggressive team to get him extended or to go at him hard next free agency season. If the Cubs make this deal, I think it's a sign that they are ready to give Kyle Tucker that contract. And if you're going to go down that road and give that first $200 million plus contract, nobody better. Well, there may be people better, but there aren't a whole lot of people better to give it to than Kyle Tucker at 28 years old. So we'll see what happens with that. That's the big fish. I mean, all of a sudden we look at this offseason, and so far we've seen the trade for Eli Morgan. We've seen the signing of Matthew Boyd. I guess technically a trade, basically picked him up for cash for Matt Tice. They're also rumored to be close to a deal on Carson Kelly. He would make a lot of sense. There's a lot of meh reaction to Carson Kelly, and I get it. But if you look at the whole catcher market, unless the Cubs are going to give up significant prospects for established catchers or young catchers like Kyle Teal, who's obviously off the board now going to the White Sox, or the rumored deal from last trade deadline to go get Logan O'Hoppe from the Angels. Young quality catching like that is really expensive. So unless the Cubs are going to give up a lot of prospect capital in that kind of deal, there's just not a lot of options out there. I mean, there was Danny Jansen, who I kind of thought the Cubs would be in on. They weren't. I think I talked about it in my last episode, but I wanted Kyle Higashioka. From the Padres. He wound up signing with the Rangers, I believe. And, but Carson Kelly is right in the mix with those guys. So he's fine. He's a solid defensive catcher. Last year, he was pretty much a league average hitter. He's 30. This isn't like bringing in 36-year-old Yan Gomes. Carson Kelly would give somebody to split time with Miguel Amaya, still give Miguel Amaya plenty of time to grow. Frankly, gives you the opportunity to split some time and potentially, as the season goes on, even mix in Moises Ballesteros. Kind of like the Cubs did 2015 when they had Miguel Montero, or 2015, 2016 when they had Miguel Montero and David Ross, and started mixing in Wilson Contreras. So it gives the Cubs a lot of options. And basically it solves one roster problem without a whole lot of fuss, without a whole lot of expense, without a whole lot of prospect capital, and lets the Cubs just get back to focusing on the other things. So, still, what do the Cubs need? So the Cubs so far, unless they've done something while I'm on this episode, probably still need at least one more starting pitcher. They definitely need more bullpen help. They need to figure out what they're doing with their bench. They need another big bat, possibly two, depending on who you trade away. And so the Cubs still have a lot to do. And I talked about last week, whatever the Cubs do. Now, getting Kyle Tucker would be that kind of big move. Okay, they're aggressive. I get it. I get why you went to get Kyle Tucker, and it makes the team better. There's still some what next component there because Kyle Tucker does not complete the roster. But that is a move. That is a big move all in and of itself. Should have happened. Other things, you trade Cody Bellinger to the Yankees, you trade Nico Hoerner to the Mariners, something like that. Like that brings you back one of your pieces. But then there's still questions about how am I going to fill out the lineup? Who's going to start? What prospects am I going to give a chance to go win a job? Where else might I look in free agency or trade for bats? Everything else comes with a what next component to it. So I think some of the what next here is, let's talk about the Rule 5 draft. So that was today. In the major league portion of the Rule 5 draft, the Cubs did not lose anybody. So there were some worries about like Christian Franklin, Frankie Scalzo. There were some arms that maybe a bad team could have stashed in their bullpen for a full season. And just to refresh the rules here, if you draft somebody in the major league portion of the Rule 5 draft, and a lot of teams don't, so the Cubs don't always make a pick. The last Rule 5 pick the Cubs made that stuck was Hector Rondon. That worked out really well. But if you draft a player in the Rule 5, in major league portion, they have to be on your active roster, so your 26-man roster for the length of the season. You don't have the option to send them down. I think there can be there's some trade rules in there somewhere, but effectively you're going to keep the guy or you're going to basically offer him back to his other team. So the Cubs drafted third baseman Gage Workman from Detroit. Now that surprised me. I had commented on Twitter and Blue Sky that, if the Cubs were going to do anything in the Rule 5, I actually didn't think they were going to make a pick. But I thought if they did, I thought they would try to get a bullpen arm they could stash for the year. But Gage is an interesting look. So he was drafted in 2020. He was a 4th-round pick. Let me bring this up. Megan Montemurro had some great info on him today that I'm using here, so I'll give her credit. He was drafted in 2020. He's 25 years old. He came up through the system as a switch-hitting, basically utility player. He's listed as primarily third base. but utility, can play all over the field. And he really struggled as a switch hitter. And so that kind of had him, his development stalled out a little bit while he was switch hitting. This year he gave up the switch hitting, hit lefty exclusively, and really had a really nice year in Double-A. He slashed 280, 366, 476. He had 18 home runs, 29 doubles, had 89 RBIs, and he mostly played shortstop and third base. So I have talked a lot on this podcast about Miles Mastrobuoni. I don't know what this means for Miles Mastrobuoni. Right now the Cubs bench is wide open. But when fans say they want Miles Mastrobuoni gone yesterday, I get the reasons why, but I've also said the Cubs are not going to get rid of Miles Mastrobuoni until there's another cheap option that can bat left-handed, can be that third organizational shortstop, and play a variety of positions. Maybe Gage Workman is that guy. He's the same age as, well, I don't know if he's exactly the same age. He's about the same age. He played high school baseball with Brennan Davis. I think they were a year apart. I think Workman's a year older. But, he's interesting. He has the ability to play all over the infield, versatile bench bat, lefty hitter, and that's key. The Cubs have lost Patrick Wisdom and Mike Tauchman. I mean, they chose to let them go. They still have Miles Mastrobuoni for now. Mastrobuoni's still pre-arb. Obviously, Gage Workman would be league minimum. But I think the obvious plan here is to put Gage Workman on the bench and see if he can stick for the year. If he can't, then the Cubs can offer him. Then the Cubs have to offer him back to Detroit for $50,000. Detroit then has the option. They could, sometimes a guy gets offered back, the team decides they've already moved on, they're not going to take him back. So if Detroit doesn't take him back, then he's the Cubs, and then he could be optioned to the minors, and then he's just a Cub going forward. Or if he makes it through this season. Now, he can get put on the injured list. Back in the day, there used to be some shenanigans around, I'm going to get this kid, I think he's really good, but he's not ready for the majors, so I'm also going to create this fake IL stint and plant him on the injured list for most of the season. That's much more policed now than it used to be, so he would have to get injured to go on the injured list, but I think he's a guy the Cubs think has a chance to stick. I think he'll compete with Miles Mastrobuoni for maybe that last bench spot, and we'll see what happens. He's interesting. He's got some speed, he's got some pop, and that's what the Cubs need. So that's the major league portion of the draft. So the Cubs did not lose anybody. They didn't have anybody from their team drafted. Then you go to the minor league portion of the draft, and I don't know a ton about all of these guys that the Cubs picked up, but there are 4 rounds. So there are 2 rounds of the Major League Rule 5 draft. Only one team made a pick in the second round. So most teams didn't make any picks today. A few more made 1, and one team made 2. So, we'll see how it goes. But in the minor league portion of the draft, you draft somebody and they just move to your system. No requirements on being at any level. So for the minor league portion of for the major league portion of the draft, should have said this up front, you have to be there's a time limit. I think it's 4 or 5 years depending on your age and when you came in, but within that span of time, you have to either be put on the 40-man roster or you're eligible to be taken in the draft. Owen Casey would have gone in this draft if the Cubs had not put him on the 40-man roster. For the minor league draft, it's a little bit different. You don't have to be on the 40-man roster, but you do have to have progressed to, I think it's like a 73-man AAA list, but you don't have to have played AAA. You just have to be kind of on that sort of top 73 in the system. And if you're not on that list, you're eligible to get taken by another team. And so the Cubs drafted a bunch of pitching today. They took right-handed pitcher William Jensen, who was in Double-A with the Giants in the first round of the minor league portion. They took right-handed pitcher Nolan Clenny from the Mets in the second round. And they got Robert Kwiatkowski from Boston in the third round. He's another interesting pitcher, and he's got a bit of a knuckleball, so I'm kind of excited about that. So Cubs picked up some minor league depth, and then in return, the Cubs did lose some players in the minor league side of the draft. They lost Double-A pitcher Richard Gallardo, high-A outfielder Jacob Wetzel, and high-A right-hand pitcher Angel Gonzalez. So Cubs picked up 3, lost 3, so kind of winds up net. And hopefully the Cubs found some interesting arms in there. We'll see what happens. But so with all this talk, what next? I mean, there's the challenge with the winter meetings is, there's so much goes into it. There's a lot of focus on it. Everybody's there. All the baseball media is there following teams around. You start hearing about the rumors getting hot, and sometimes things can seem to be burning just red hot, and like it's going to happen imminently, and then it takes another couple days, or it happens next week, especially with trades. With trades, I think for every trade you see completed, there were probably at least 10 to 12 iterations of that trade discussed before they actually nailed it down. Because if I'm going to make a trade, if I'm trying to trade you hamburgers for notebooks, I'm going to try to give you 1 hamburger for 7 notebooks. You're going to try to give me 2 notebooks for 6 hamburgers. Like it's, I'm going to put forth a deal to start with that has me winning the deal, and they're going to do the same, and you counter, and eventually you land in the middle or you don't. And so we see this with the Mariners. I would love for Luis Castillo to come over and be a part of the Cubs rotation. I think also the Cubs would, if they had their choice, would probably rather get one of the Mariners' younger pitchers, maybe like a Brian Wu or, any of those other guys. The younger guys who are more cost controlled are going to cost more. That's just how it works. So, you go back and forth on deals, you throw a bunch of versions together. It sounds like the Cubs and Astros have talked about a lot of different players for this potential deal. And, it'll be what it'll be. But it might happen today. It might have already happened for all I know. But it might happen tomorrow. It might happen next week. Like, if the winter meetings are over and people leave, it doesn't mean the talks stop. It also doesn't mean that, I see all the sleepy Jed stuff. Like Jed's out there just like not doing this stuff. Like they're actively working on it, but it may make perfect sense. The Astros may not want to trade yet until they figure out what's going on with Alex Bregman. They may not want to just trade with the Cubs without getting the Yankees' final offer. And the Yankees might not be able to make that final offer until they know whether they're getting Alex Bregman. The Cubs are simultaneously working on a deal with the Yankees with Cody Bellinger. That might impact whether or not how hard they go in on Kyle Tucker. So, there are so many moving parts. It's hard to just put these in a time box and say, well, it didn't happen today. Jed sucks. It's not going to happen. Like, we just don't know. And there are so many other deals. Like this deal with Kyle Tucker just kind of popped up. I'm sure there have been discussions we didn't know about before it was reported in the media. But, there might be some other trade we haven't even thought of yet that Carter's been working on in the background. Who knows? But I do expect the Cubs still to come out of this offseason with 1 to 2 more relievers. I expect them to pick up probably at least 2 bats. I expect them to pick up probably at least 1 more starting pitcher. And that's how it's going to go. Like I was all set today. Maybe I'll do it next week. I was going to do a breakdown of, to get through a major league season, you got to get through like 1,458 innings. When you look at 162 games times 9 innings, obviously that's not a perfect number. But I was going to get into talking through the strategies of how to build that pitching staff to get those out. So you've got, even though you might have 20, 30 more guys come through and pitch for your team in a given season, at any point in time, you can have 13 pitchers on the roster, 14th if there's a doubleheader day. But so you've got 5 starters, unless you want to go with a 6-man rotation, and 8 relievers. And so you map out those innings, like how much do you realistically want to get out of your starting pitchers? And so then how many bullpen innings you have to cover. Like that's going to start to dictate, as the Cubs stack up this depth, what directions they want to go. So more to come on that, but it's all about the what next. Like this roster is not done. The Cubs are not going to, whether this trade happens or not, just be done with the roster they have now. Expect more moves. As we go through this, like every team that signs a player has got to cut a player. Every time a team makes a trade and they trade minor leaguers not on the 40-man roster for major leaguers, DFAs have to happen. The Cubs are going to continue to watch the waiver wire. They're going to watch for guys who maybe they didn't expect to be cut or suddenly become available because a team made a move nobody saw coming. And now there's a redundant player that the Cubs really like and would really help make this team better. And the Cubs need everything from star power to bench bats. I was on the Bricks Behind the Ivy podcast with Jeff Rogauskas this week, and I would recommend checking out his podcast. And one of the things we talked about was he wanted to come on and talk about what free agents should the Cubs pursue. And he went to some bigger additions. He talked about Juan Soto. I decided to go the other direction and talk about bullpen and bench pickups. Not because I don't think the Cubs will or should go for more star power. They absolutely should. They have to have some big swings this offseason. But the point I was making was that bullpen depth is critical. We've seen it the last 2 years. The Cubs didn't do well enough, so go get more. And for the bench, I went a little unconventional with a former highly touted prospect that really hasn't panned out, had a lot of injuries. And my argument was less about that player. And go check out the episode if you want to hear the discussion. It's less about that player specifically and more about taking some shots on the bench to have some upside. Yeah, the Cubs kind of had that with Patrick Wisdom. I mean, he hit 30 home runs in 2023. So you have a guy on your bench who can run into one, who can go on a heater and all that stuff. But they also had guys on that bench, whether we're talking going back to Edwin Rios and Nick Madrigal and guys that just didn't have any offensive upside. And you know this team is going to have 8 starting position players. Ideally, you have more than that and you kind of use your bench on a regular basis. But at minimum, 8 starting defensive players and a DH, so 9. You know you're going to have a backup catcher, whoever that is, whether it's Carson Kelly, whether they go with 3 or whatever. But you know you're going to have 1. And so then that's 11 guys. Sorry, that is 10 guys. That leaves 3 spots on the bench. You're going to need 1 more outfielder, 1 more utility infielder, and then probably that last guy is just best player I can find. It's either like a pure utility, can play all over the field. Maybe that's where you go for just a big stick. Go get a guy who's got some pop, who can come in and play at the corners, DH, whatever. But you have some options there. But there are certain spots that are going to be filled by a certain profile player. And that's where I think Gage Workman, the Rule 5 draft pickup, is really interesting because he could be a potentially another option in the Miles Mastrobuoni realm that offers a little bit more pop while still giving you the defensive flexibility. And I don't know that he's as fast as Miles, but he is reported as being pretty quick. And just one more thing back, I meant to mention earlier on the Itzhak Paredes to Houston thing. Obviously that park was made for him. I saw John Anderson on Twitter posted Itzhak Paredes expected home runs by park in 2024. If he played his full season in Tampa Bay, 21 home runs, Wrigley Field 13, because in left field at Wrigley Field, he's got to deal with the well, got to deal with the wind, all that stuff. Minute Maid Park 26. Like if he goes to Houston, he's just going to pull balls to the Crawford boxes all the time. So we'll see if that happens. We'll see what the Cubs do this week. If they do something huge, maybe I'll even come on with a bonus reaction. Ideally, maybe 5 minutes from now if I know I just went through, but I don't. I've seen some alerts come through. I don't think that trade's been finalized, but hopefully it happens. I would love Kyle Tucker. I would love for him to be the anchor piece we've been waiting on for this next era of Cubs baseball. If not, I hope they find it somewhere else. But I'll be back next week, if nothing else, and we'll talk about what the Cubs did or didn't do in the winter meetings. And again, what next? Where do we go from here? Go Cubs. Thank you for joining me today. If you liked the episode, please drop a rating and a review wherever you get your podcasts. Like, subscribe, all those glorious things. And share the episode with a friend. Just a few seconds from you gives me great feedback and helps other Cub fans find the show. You can find me on Twitter or X, Instagram, TikTok, Threads, Blue Sky, and YouTube, all at CubsPS Plus. And check out the Patreon page at patreon.com/CubsPS Plus to help support the show. As always, the theme music for this podcast is Prospect Park West by Jerry McCoy. This is Mike Waller, host of the CubsPS Plus podcast. Every day with Cubs baseball or talking about Cubs baseball is a great day. Go Cubs!